Good morning, Southeast. Welcome to another class on Thin Places, Heaven Reimagined. We're happy that you're with us today. We're glad for all of those who across the country are choosing to join us at this time also. As we continue our discussion on Thin Places, I want to go back for just a little bit and revisit a previous slide that we had on the faith continuum. From time to time, I've asked you to place yourself on this faith continuum. Where would you be between hoping that what we have in the Bible is true and firmly, confidently, assuredly accepting it as fact? We all find ourselves somewhere on that continuum if we are indeed believers in God. Atheists, of course, don't have to worry about it. They're not on the continuum at all. How do you know where you are? My friend Kyle Chambers sent me an email this week and was recommending an author, lecturer, psychologist named Jordan Peterson. And I went out on YouTube and was watching some of his videos there. And as I was paying half attention to it and doing other things, as I often do, he said something that really grabbed my attention. And I wanted to share that with you this morning because I think it addresses the issue of how do you know where you are on this faith continuum. And it's not anything that you don't already know, but it's stated in a way that's very simple and yet I think quite profound. Where we are in our belief, very simply stated, is what I act out. Now, I can tell you what I believe. I can tell myself what I believe. I can even convince myself of where I am on this continuum. But the truth of the matter is, the fact of the matter is, that where I am at any given time on this faith continuum is what I act out. Everything else is just where I would like to be or where I hope you think I am, but that's the fact of the matter. If I act in a way that doesn't demonstrate my belief, if you will, that there is a God, that He loves me, that He has prepared a place for me, and there is nothing more important in this world than loving Him and pleasing Him, then that will control, that will direct the way that I live my life. Whether I'm with you, or alone, or in a crowd, or under any circumstances. My position on the faith continuum is the product of how I live my life, how I act out my faith. Now, it's very simple, but it's also very profound. I also want to go back to another slide that we've talked about a few weeks before because this is going to introduce us into where we're going today. And that is the idea of dualism versus monism. Those of us who are God believers, who believe that God created the universe and that He sustains it, and that we have a spiritual life that is experiencing a material existence, are called dualists. Because we see the mind as one thing and the soul or the spirit as another thing, separate from each other, working together, working in unison with each other, but separate from each other. The monist, the materialist, is opposed to dualism. His life perspective, his worldview, his paradigm does not allow the idea of dualism. And truth be known, most of science is unequivocal that the mind is the product of the brain and nothing but the brain. In that worldview, there is no aspect of the mind, the personality, or the self, or the soul, if you will, that is not completely caused by material influences, atoms and molecules and quarks. The mind, the consciousness, the soul is only what the brain does. And when the brain can no longer do it, then the soul no longer exists, and like the little dog Rover, we are dead all over. As we talk about these ideas of life after death, of people coming back from a near-death experience and reporting these phenomenal experiences, it is absolutely imperative, mandatory, compulsory, that the monist, the materialist, be able to debunk that, to demonstrate that that is not a spiritual experience, that it is a materially caused experience. He has to do that because his whole worldview rests on the idea that the spirit is only what the mind produces. So if he fails to account for that in every one of these aspects of the near-death experience, well, then the whole basis for his belief system, if you will, falls apart. Now, I debated for a while about how to approach the scientific and medical explanations, and I should have explanations in quotation marks, for NDEs, and I may come back to these later on in more detail. I don't know. We'll see how it develops. But I thought this morning that I would just go through a laundry list of the explanations that are more commonly presented by those who are compelled to disprove any spiritual, paranormal, extrasensory aspect of these reported events. So I'm going to just go through fairly quickly with a list of them, and kind of at the top of that list are those people who simply discard them, the events, the episodes, the reported instances as being either dreams or illusions or hallucinations. There are a number of things about dreams and hallucinations and illusions that are diametrically opposed to what happens in these reported near-death experiences. I'm not going to all of those now. Some of them will come up a little bit later on as we talk about it this morning. So let us just kind of look at a laundry list of things that are proposed in rebuttal to the idea that these are spiritual experiences, that these are outside of the material produced effects of science. Some have said that they are self-fulfilling prophecies or expectations. In other words, people have read the literature, they have heard the stories, and they have the idea that this is what ought to happen. And so they either manufacture that or embellish upon what happened in a way to make it fit with these things that have been reported. Of course, that doesn't take into account the event when it occurs in children, or when it occurs before the 1975 explosion of literature about these thousands and thousands of people who are experiencing this. It doesn't take into account people in other countries who have never heard the word near-death experience, yet have reported the same similar experiences. Another offering is sleep paralysis. This is when REM, rapid eye movement, sleep intrudes into the wakefulness state. And there's material about what happens when that occurs. None of it really fits very well, as I can tell, into an explanation of anything that we're talking about with a near-death experience. One that's pretty commonly held by neurologists is that if they have somebody upon whom they're doing surgery and they take a probe, they can stimulate the right temporal parietal junction, and that's part of the brain. And in stimulating that, they can recreate one or more of the elements that are reported by near-death experiencers. And I don't doubt but what that's true. But that doesn't begin to account for the many elements that are a unique and consistent aspect of all these different people having these experiences. And of course, in the vast majority of them, there's no stimulation of the right temporal parietal junction involved in it anyway. Some have said that Parkinson's disease can cause some of the same manifestations that we see in the near-death experience, and I don't doubt but whether that's true, but it only accounts for one or two of the experiences, and very, very, very few of the people who report these experiences have anything resembling Parkinson's disease as a part of their physical being. One very common one that's held up is the idea of anoxia. And anoxia is low oxygen levels in the blood, and this of course results when the heart stops beating and blood stops flowing through the lungs, and so the lungs, which are the exchanger of oxygen, cease to function, and so there is this sudden anoxia that takes place. And the theory is that this anoxia generates these images that people are experiencing. There's several things that would keep that from being adequate explanation for most of the things that happen in these reported near-death experiences. Hypercarbia, high carbon dioxide levels in the brain, hypercarbia actually creates confusion, and that's really just the opposite of what is happening in these reported cases. A lot of work has gone into looking at the effects of hallucinogenic and psychedelic drugs and how they mimic or recreate some of the aspects of the near-death experience. And we're talking about things like LSD and peyote and morphine and cocaine and things of that nature. And it's true that some of them do mimic certain elements of the reported experiences, but again, almost none of the people who are reporting these have been exposed to any of these drugs, and even if they are intentionally exposed, they might reproduce some semblance of one or two of the elements, but they don't begin to cover the broad spectrum of what happens when these events occur. Angular gyrus misfiring. The angular gyrus is a part of the brain processing center, and the thought is that in the dying process this goes haywire and it magically creates all of these very lucid and very rememberable events that occur during these reported instances. Another is false memory syndrome. I've never quite understood why that would even be brought up, because if you're referring to the life review is just the opposite of false memory, because the life review brings back into the remembrance those events that have long past been forgotten, but which are verifiable as being extremely accurate. So it's the opposite of false memory syndrome. Another thing that comes up is abnormal functioning of dopamine. Dopamine, of course, is a condition that is a substance that is created by the body. It is a neurotransmitter. It relays messages between the cells throughout the body. And the idea is that in those last dying moments, the body produces this overabundance of dopamine, and that's what creates these illusions and dream-like episodes. But there's no scientific evidence that that happens, even physically, or that it would have that effect mentally. but yet it's one of the more common held concepts of why these things are physical rather than metaphysical. Another that's proposed is anesthetic ketamine. Ketamine is one of the chemicals that's used in the anesthetic process of surgeries, the anesthesia. It's been used for a long time. It's intended to create a state of coma. It's intended to be a memory eraser, actually. It has, to my knowledge, the opposite effect of creating a very lucid, a very detailed memory of what has occurred. I've been put to sleep a number of times. I don't know if they use ketamine or not, but I've never had any remembrance of anything while I was asleep. I'm not sure exactly how that answers to the explanation of the physical nature of near-death experiences. And one final one, retinal ischemia. This is when there's a depleted flow of blood and oxygen to the eye, and the theory is that this would create images that might be equated to what is imagined or seen by the people reporting the near-death experience. Well, that's about 15 of maybe 20 or 25 different theories that are put forth as to why near-death experiences are not spiritual experiences. They are physical, materialistically generated experiences. Again, we could go into much more detail about each and every one of these, but I really don't want to do that. I'm just simply going to say that in the grand scheme of things, not one of them answers to all of the different elements that we see represented in the reported instances, and none of the, or very few of the people who have these experiences are subjected to the things that are being used to try to recreate, regenerate a comparable experience from a material point of view. Well, this morning I want to introduce you to Dr. Jeffrey Long. Dr. Long is a very important person in the research area of near-death, out-of-body, time-of-death experiences. Done extensive work over a long period of time. His book on evidence of the afterlife is one of the classic works, and he is a practicing radiation oncologist at Mary Bird Perkins Cancer Center in Houma, Louisiana. Back in 1998, he established the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, NDERF. He accumulates self-reported cases of near-death experience on that website. There are two websites. His website called NDERF.org. On it he has over 5,000 self-reported near-death experiences from more than 23 different languages from all over the world. It's a list that continues to grow. It's open to anyone who chooses to access it as far as reporting events in their life or simply researching the events that others have reported. The other dominant website, and there are a lot of more obscure ones, but the two most prominent ones are NDERF and IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies, which is also a very large site that looks at self-reported cases and forms a basis for a lot of the ongoing studies that are happening in the field of near-death experiences. Jeffrey Long is one of a number of professionals who have done extensive study on NDEs, who is a part of an upcoming documentary that will come out in the year 2021 that discusses in great detail the different elements of the near-death experience. The name of the documentary is The Veil, and I'm looking forward to having that available for us. This morning I want to share a short clip of Dr. Long that's actually taken from that upcoming documentary.
Several years after I first read about near-death experience in a medical journal, I was having dinner with a college friend of mine and his wife. And during the course of dinner, she said that she had allergies so severe that once she was even under general anesthesia in an operation, had an allergic reaction, and she coded. And that was all she said at that point in time, but the way she said that triggered my thinking as a doctor. There seemed to be more to the story. That was my instinct as a physician. So I popped the question, did anything happen to you when your heart stopped, when you coded on the operating room table? And she immediately said, why, yes, and went on to share the first near-death experience I ever heard in person. Here she described how her consciousness went above her body. She saw the frantic efforts at her own resuscitation, the racket the electrocardiogram machine makes when it flatlines. She then went through a tunnel, was in an unearthly, beautiful realm, had a review of her life, and had to make a decision about returning to her own physical body, which she finally decided she would do. After she relayed that story, she asked in a puzzled way, but I don't know what that experience is. She'd never heard about near-death experience. It was then I said, I think I know what happened. I read about this several years ago. I think you had a near-death experience. And from that moment on, I was struck. I knew that if this happened consistently to a large number of people, if this was a real experience, if this was, if you will, nature's way about telling us something about the big picture, this was extremely important indeed. And I was ready to begin my investigation journey to learn more about what I just heard about. What's remarkable about near-death experiences is that they shouldn't happen. Many of them are associated with a cardiac arrest, which means your heart stops beating like a heart attack. The moment your heart stops beating, of course, immediately blood stops flowing to the brain. 10 to 20 seconds after that event, the EEG or electroencephalogram, which is a measure of brain electrical activity, goes absolutely flat. There is no measurable brain electrical activity. It should be impossible to have any kind of conscious memory at that point in time, and yet, literally by the thousands, people have reported near-death experiences under those circumstances. The key to understanding near-death experience is to understand that they're common, that what happens during them are consistently observed, to understand the evidence for their reality, and to understand that they're absolutely medically inexplicable. There's no substitute for actually listening, and listening carefully to people that have had these near-death experiences, either in person or reading the accounts from a wide variety of sources. People that have near-death experiences change in ways that are called after effects. That means what occurs after their near-death experience. It's been very consistently observed in both prospective and retrospective studies. What's been observed is that they, of course, essentially no longer fear death. From their perspective, they know what lies beyond death's doors because they've seen it. They've looked beyond the veil. They know that there's a wonderful afterlife. So they may fear the dying process, but they don't fear what lies beyond. And of course, they become more interested in life. They understand that life is meaningful, purposeful. They understand the critical importance of love. They typically become much more loving, compassionate people, both to themselves. They take better care of themselves, as well as in their outreach to other people. The peace and love in near-death experiences is described as unearthly. When they have that as part of their near-death experiences, outside of anything they ever knew, in its intensity, how it envelops them, that's what's so exciting to people that have this. They didn't even know they could feel that in their life. And so it's not surprising that when they return to their body and recover from that close brush with death, that they try to bring that piece of heaven into their life in other ways when they interact with other people. In my research of near-death experience, I've absolutely lost my fear of death. I, like the thousands of near-death experiencers that I've investigated, all have come to that same conclusion. We're literally spiritual beings having an earthly existence at this time. When we die, and we all will, then we're going to return to our real home, that spiritual home, which is so often, and I think aptly, called heaven. And that is going to be an absolutely wonderful existence for each and every one of us.
We want to look now rather briefly at 9 lines of evidence for validity of NDEs that Dr. Long has put together in his studies. 9 reasons that give us cause to believe that these are true, actual events, and I would dare say scientifically ascertainable events. Number 1, the lucid, organized experience while unconscious, comatose, or clinically dead. Medically and logically, it should not be possible for unconscious people to have highly lucid experiences that are clear and logically structured. Not only do they have these experiences, but most report an actual supernormal consciousness. They are more conscious, more aware. It is more real to them than any reality they have experienced on their time on Earth. Near-death experiences often occur in association with cardiac arrest. 10 to 20 seconds following cardiac arrest, electroencephalogram measurements find no measurable brain cortical electrical activity. The EKGs and the EEGs go flat, in other words. A prolonged, detailed, lucid experience following cardiac arrest should not be possible. Yet this is reported in many of the NDEs that we have on record. Number 2, seeing ongoing events from a location apart from the physical body while unconscious. These are out-of-body experiences, and these are even more common than the full NDE experiences. These are really not all that rare. In some of the reports, about 45% of near-death experiences report OBEs, which involves them seeing and often hearing ongoing earthly events from a perspective that is apart and usually above their physical bodies. They later accurately describe their own resuscitation. They accurately describe things that are going on during the time that they are comatose. There are so many examples of this, and we may look at some of them later on in more detail. Major studies to explore the validity of OBE recall validity have been undertaken by a number of very prominent and well-respected researchers and doctors. Dr. Michael Sabum, Dr. Penny Satori, that we have already seen earlier in our studies, Dr. Janice Holden, and of course Dr. Jeffrey Long. The high percentage of accurate out-of-body observations during near-death experiences does not seem explainable by any possible physical brain function as it is currently known. And these are things that have been reported by the person who was comatose after the resuscitation that have been verified by people who were present, verified by the person undergoing the experience in very tangible and otherwise unexplainable ways. Number 3, near-death experiences with vision in the blind and supernormal vision in people who are not blind. A large study of this was done by Dr. Kenneth Ring. This included people who were born totally blind, who had NDEs, and who described visual content consistent with typical sighted NDEs. For example, Marta, a 5-year-old blind girl who walked into a lake, said, "I slowly breathed in the water and became unconscious. A beautiful lady dressed in bright white light pulled me out. The lady looked into my eyes, asked me what I wanted. I wanted to travel around the lake. For the first time, I was able to see leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles. and what was in people's backyards. I was curious about what people who are born blind dream. How do they dream? And I did a little bit of research on it, not extensive, and I'm not being presented as an authority, but it seems to me that from the literature, people who are born blind, who have never had any sight at all, don't even dream in visual ways like you and I would think of. But yet, there have been several studies done, as this one, for example, where blind people, either blind early in their life or having never had sight, report the same visual effects in these near-death experiences that people do who have had sight their entire life. Near-death experiences that occur while under general anesthesia. Under general anesthesia, it should not be possible to have a lucid, organized memory. I know I never have any memory at all when I come out from under anesthesia. Following cardiac arrest, the EEG becomes flat in 10 to 20 seconds, and there is usually amnesia prior to and following the cardiac arrest. The occurrence of a cardiac arrest while under general anesthesia is a combination of circumstances in which no memory from that time should be possible. Dr. Long and Dr. Grayson have both done extensive studies of just such individuals who have had conscious, highly lucid NDEs under these conditions. This is not medically explainable. It is medically inexplicable. Number 5, near-death experiences and life reviews. The life review includes awareness of what others were feeling and thinking at the time earlier in their life when they interacted with them. This is often surprising and unexpected to the ones experiencing the NDE. Life reviews often include long forgotten details of their earlier life that the NDEers later confirm really happened. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this is just the opposite of what we see from any of the ways in which scientists and doctors have tried to recreate these events. If NDEs were unreal experiences, it would be expected that there would be significant error in life reviews and possibly hallucinatory features. But this is not the case. And the life review is a very commonly experienced part of these reported NDEs, even in children, surprisingly, because they don't have a lot of life to review yet. Number 6, encountering deceased loved ones in near-death experiences. In dreams or hallucinations, when familiar persons are present, they are more likely to be living and from recent memory. Now, that's my experience. I might remember people from a while back, but they're usually living people. I can't even remember having a dream in which I was interacting with people who were already deceased. This is in sharp contrast to near-death experiences where familiar persons encountered are almost always deceased. I would say 99% of the time. Cases have been reported of seeing a person who they thought was living, but in fact had recently died. They come back and talk about who they saw, and only then do they learn from other family members that the person that they saw had recently passed away, and they were not familiar with that. They were not aware of that. Some have reported seeing relatives who died before they were born, whose identity was established by old pictures. It would be like me dreaming of my great-great-grandfather and then having my mother or father drag out a picture and say, "Is this who you saw?" And I would say, "Yeah, that's him." There have even been reports of meeting unborn siblings of whom they were unaware. Parents who lost children for whatever reason before they were born and never really shared that information with their other children, and they've had children come back and report, or adults come back and report, meeting those unborn siblings in their near-death experience. That says a lot about abortion, does it not? Number 7, near-death experiences of young children. At an early age, children are less likely to have established religious beliefs, cultural understandings about death, or even awareness of what death is. Very young children would be very unlikely to have heard about near-death experiences or understand them. Dr. Long did an extensive study of NDEs among children aged 5 and under. The average age of the children in that study was 3.6 years. He found no statistically, it's easy for you to say, significant difference between their reported experience and a control group of adults. What the children are reporting, and yes, they may be using child-appropriate language to try to describe the indescribable, but what they are reporting is not statistically different from what the average adult would report for that element. Dr. Sherry Sutherland reviewed 30 years of scholarly literature regarding the NDEs of children and reports even pre-linguistic children, children who have not yet learned a language, have later reported quite complex experiences after they develop a language with which to express those experiences. That's hard to explain from any of the avenues that the scientists have explored to explain, justify from a material point of view how NDEs are occurring. Number 8, cross-cultural study of near-death experiences. Over 500 near-death experiences in non-English languages have been shared with NDERF over the years. Dr. Long's investigation of NDEs from around the world shows that their content is strikingly similar. If near-death experiences were considerably influenced by pre-existing religious and cultural beliefs, it would be expected that there would be significant differences in the content of NDEs from different cultures. All near-death experiences appear in Western NDEs are present also in non-Western NDEs. Now, it's true, again, that the language used to describe these will be culturally derived. It would have to be, would it not? But the elements themselves, the nature of what they are experiencing in these near-death occasions, are being reported by people all over the world from all different ages, as far back as we have records, in a very consistent manner. And finally, number 9, near-death experience after effects. And for me, this is one of the most significant events to confirm the validity of what happens in these events. Following near-death experience, significant changes in the lives of NDEers are commonly observed. This is not true in any of the other things that the scientists and the medical people have offered as substitute explanations for this. You do not have this ongoing, life-altering effect. In a study by Dr. Pim van Lommel, he divided survivors of cardiac arrest into a group that had NDEs and a group that did not. All of these had heart attacks. All of them had cardiac arrests. The after effects of both groups were assessed after 2 years and again after 8 years. The group of cardiac arrest survivors with NDEs were statistically more likely to have a reduced fear of death, an increased belief in life after death, an interest in the meaning of life, an increased acceptance of others, and were demonstrably more loving and empathic. Every event that we see of these videos that we're looking at where these people have had these reported events always have this life-changing worldview, this life-changing paradigm as a result of their experience. It changes them, and it's not temporary, it's lasting. And it continues to grow rather than to diminish. They become more of what they're becoming rather than less. And for me, that is truly a very convincing evidence of the validity of these. Dreams don't do that. Hallucinations don't do that. Illusions don't do that. Chemically induced byproducts do not have life-changing effects. But over and over again, almost universally, NDEs have that profound and lasting effect. A few conclusions. Multiple lines of evidence point to the conclusion that near-death experiences are medically inexplicable and cannot be explained by known physical brain function. And believe me, many efforts have been and are being attempted to disprove this, because this is absolutely anathema to the materialist. It refutes everything that he holds sacred and scientific. And in their survey of 1,122 NDEers, asked, how do you currently view the reality of your experience? 95.6% responded, definitely real. What I experienced was real. And in most cases they say more real than what I had ever experienced before. Included among this over 1,000 sampling were physicians, scientists, attorneys, nurses, people who had nothing to gain by misrepresenting the event. No one in the psychiatric, scientific, or medical fields has produced a suitable counter explanation for near-death experiences. They stand as something external, outside the material world. Well, we spent a great deal of time on this today, but I hope that you found it interesting and maybe even inspiring. We didn't get to our ongoing study of the biblical examples of the thin places where God interacts directly with his people in supernatural, non-materialistic, if you will, ways. We're still looking at Abraham, and Lord willing, we'll come back to him next Sunday, finish up with him, and move on to his son Isaac and Isaac's sons Jacob, and on down the line. Well, I hope you are prospering. I hope you are thriving during this abnormal period. May God's richest blessings be on you. Take care of yourself. We're going to get through this. We're going to be back together hopefully sooner rather than later. And I'm anxiously waiting for that time. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful, God-blessed week.